So I want to talk a little bit about fats, proteins and carbohydrates and how we get fat, and really clear up some of the issues. Try and make it as simple as possible to get a real good grasp on what are the key issues in terms of diet and nutrition around body weight and losing it, because we've got the summer coming up. So we talk about high protein diets, we talk about having things being low fat, and we talk about carbohydrates, and what I wanted to do is just give a real simple explanation for what's a protein, what's a fat and what's a carbohydrate, and show you how they play a role in how much body fat you're carrying or not. So start off with a protein in really simple broad brushstroke terms. Protein is meat, fish and fowl. Okay, there's not an awful lot of sort of artificially produced or manufactured food that's high in protein. Maybe some of these protein shakes that bodybuilders use. I wouldn't put those high on your list of things to consume, but that's probably about the only thing I can think of really that's an excellent source of protein, or that's a high source of protein that's manufactured rather than natural. So fats, kind of two categories for fats. We've got fats that come with meat, fish and fowl, like animal fats and fish oils, and we've also got fats that tend to come from a more vegetable-y source, like olive oil, sunflower oil, that sort of thing. So the difference tends to be that animal fats tend to be more solid at room temperature, they tend to be saturated, and vegetable oils tend to be more liquid at room temperature, tend to be polyunsaturated. And I can do, fats is a whole other video. I'm not going to go to the far end of to discuss fats at this stage, but just to give you a bit of an understanding that they can either come from meats, fish and fowl sources, or they can come from vegetable sources, which is where we find our carbohydrates. So fruits and vegetables and grains are the sort of very natural sources of where we would get carbohydrate from in our diet in terms of the calories and the energy that we get. Sugar and alcohol are also really big issues when it comes to carbohydrate. So when you're talking about getting your calories, when you're talking about getting your energy from your diet, you'll get it either from protein, from fats or from carbohydrates. So the energy will either come from meat, fish and fowl, from the fats that come with meat, fish and fowl, or the fats that come from carbohydrate sources, stuff that grew out of the ground, or the energy will come from a carbohydrate source, in which case it's likely to be fruits, vegetables, grains, sugar or alcohol. Okay? So that breaks them up into three. What I'm going to do now is kind of combine them back into two. Okay? But just before I do that, I want to tell you about a study that was done using groups of people who were in prison at the time, and they volunteered for it. It wasn't like a human rights violation or anything like that, but what they tried to do was try to get people to overconsume. So they knew how many calories these people were eating beforehand, and what they did for a week was they gave them a 90% protein diet. And on this 90% protein diet, they said, we want you to eat as much as you can. Go for it, go for it, go for it. And these guys found that they just couldn't overconsume. So they were plus 0 calories. In a week, they just were so satisfied with what they'd eaten on 90% diet of meat, fish and fowl, they didn't overconsume. So gave them a week off, brought them back in, and said, we're now going to give you a 90% fat diet, and we want you to overconsume. We want you to eat loads and loads and loads. So they use a lot of dairy produce, they use a lot of cheese, a lot of oil, a lot of butter, all that sort of stuff. And after a week, they found that these guys couldn't overconsume. They got to a point where their bodies were just so satisfied, they didn't want to eat any more food. So plus 0 calories on the 90% fat diet. Gave them a week off, brought them back in, gave them a 90% carbohydrate diet. A lot of bread, a lot of pasta, a lot of sugar, a lot of potatoes, a lot of white rice. Any kind of rice is very high in carbohydrate, a lot of fruit, all that sort of stuff, 90% carbohydrate diet. And what they found was the average overconsumption was 8,000 calories per person. So when they were given a 90% carbohydrate diet, they could easily consume 8,000 calories a day more than they were consuming before on a much more balanced diet. So what that says is it's really easy for the body to take on board more of this fruit, more vegetable, more grain, more sugar, more alcohol than we actually need. But it's very difficult for us to take on more fat than we actually need, and it's difficult for us to take on more protein than we actually need. And the neat thing about that is if you take away all processed food and you go back, say, 35,000 years, you've only got two kinds of food. You've got food that once had a heartbeat, and you've got food that once grew out of the ground. And it turns out that food that once grew out of the ground is really easy to overconsume, and food that once had a heartbeat is not very easy to overconsume. Now, there's a really good reason for that, which is 35,000 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to get much food that grew out of the ground in January. You wouldn't have been able to get much food that grew out of the ground in February, nor March, nor April. You might have had a little bit in May, but really it's June, July and August and a little bit of September where you have the opportunity to overconsume, because fruits appear on the tree, because food is naturally harvested at that time. The food that's grown out of the ground is naturally harvested at that time. So what follows that period of overconsumption? Because when it's there, as these prisoners proved, oh God, we can eat it. What follows it is, no way, no way, no way, I'm back again, no way, no way, no way. So there's nothing to eat October, November, December, January, February, March that grew out of the ground. But it's cold and other animals die, because incidentally, food that once had a heartbeat you can get in January, February, March, right the way through to December. If you've got a caribou or a deer or some wild cattle or a rabbit or something like that that's available for you to eat, if it's more than a year old, it's been a potential food source for you for 365 days. Strawberries aren't. Grain isn't. Potatoes aren't. They're only harvestable for a small time of the year. And following that time of the year, we would have needed to have been fat to see us through the winter. And we would have worked off all that fat because we wouldn't have eaten any of these carbohydrates all this time. And we would have worked off that fat, and then when it came around to this period again, we would have put fat back on and we would have gone round and round and round. Unfortunately today, there's a Tesco's Express on every corner. We can get in the supermarkets to deliver carbohydrates to our front door 365 days of the year. And there's never any cessation in us eating these carbohydrates, which our bodies are programmed to overconsume by about 8,000 calories a day if we give it the opportunity. Which is one of the reasons, if we don't have decent levels of fish, meat, fowl in our diets, we become really, really hungry. We just lose this sense of satiety, we lose this sense of satisfaction in our diet, and it becomes very difficult for us to keep our energy levels up, keep ourselves exercising and going to the gym, and it becomes really, really easy to slip into these high sugar foods like chocolate, like sweets, like candies, like cereal bars, and drinking plenty of alcohol, which has a massive impact on our blood sugar, and it's through blood sugar that you store fat.